Hey everybody, Rebecca here. Today is 2/7/2025 and the time is 10:09 a.m. I have y'all looking at the Faroe Islands, and that is because today's video is about the Faroe Islands. If you are new here, please hit subscribe, please share and like the video, and I will let David tell you the story of the Faroe Islands.
The Faroe Islands. The Faroe or Faroe Islands, or simply the Faroes, are an archipelago in the North Atlantic Ocean and an autonomous territory of the Kingdom of Denmark. The official language of the country is Faroese, which is closely related to and partially mutually intelligible with Icelandic. Located at a similar distance from Iceland, Norway, and the United Kingdom, the islands have a total area of about 1,400 square kilometers with a population of 54,676 as of August 2023. The terrain is rugged, and the subpolar oceanic climate is windy, wet, cloudy and cool. Despite the northerly climate, the temperatures are moderated by the Gulf Stream and average above freezing throughout the year, hovering around 12 degrees Celsius in summer and 5 degrees Celsius in winter, as a result of its northerly latitude and proximity to the Arctic Circle. The islands experience perpetual civil twilight during summer nights and very short winter days. The capital and largest city, Tórshavn, receives the fewest recorded hours of sunshine of any city in the world at only 840 per year. While archaeological evidence places the first known habitation as early as the 4th century, Fayetteville Saga and the writings of Dikul place initial Norse settlement in the early 9th century, as with the subsequent settlement of Iceland. The islands were mainly settled by Norwegians and Norse Gaels, who additionally brought thralls of Gaelic origin. Following the introduction of Christianity by Sigmundur Brestison, the islands came under Norwegian rule in the early 11th century. The Faroe Islands followed Norway's integration into the Kalmar Union in 1397 and came under de facto Danish rule following that union's dissolution in 1523. Following the introduction of Lutheranism in 1538, Faroese was banned in churches, schools, and state institutions, and disappeared from writing for more than 3 centuries. The islands were formally ceded to Denmark in 1814 by the Treaty of Kiel along with Greenland and Iceland, and the Lagting was subsequently replaced by a Danish judiciary. Following the re-establishment of the Lagting and an official Faroese orthography, the Faroese language conflict saw Danish being gradually displaced by Faroese as the language of the church, public education and law in the first half of the 20th century. The islands were occupied by the British during the Second World War, who refrained from governing Faroese internal affairs. Inspired by this period of relative self-government and the declaration of Iceland as a republic in 1944, the islands held a referendum in 1946 that resulted in a narrow majority for independence. The results were annulled by Christianization, and subsequent negotiations led to the Faroe Islands being granted home rule in 1948. While remaining part of the Kingdom of Denmark to this day, the Faroe Islands have extensive autonomy and control most areas apart from military defense, policing, justice and currency, with partial control over its foreign affairs. Because the Faroe Islands are not part of the same customs area as Denmark, they have an independent trade policy and can establish their own trade agreements with other states. The islands have an extensive bilateral free trade agreement with Iceland, known as the Højvik Agreement. In the Nordic Council, they are represented as part of the Danish delegation. In certain sports, the Faroe Islands field their own national teams. They did not become a part of the European Economic Community in 1973, instead keeping autonomy over their own fishing waters. As a result, the Faroe Islands are not a part of the European Union today. The Lagting, albeit suspended between 1816 and 1852, holds a claim as one of the oldest continuously running parliaments in the world. The island's endonym Faroeyjar, as well as its English name Faroe Islands, derive from the Old Norse Faereyjar. The second element oyar is a holdover from Old Faroese. Sound changes have rendered the word's modern form as Oyjar. Names for individual islands also preserve the old form. The name's ultimate etymological origin has been subject to dispute. The most widely held theory, first attested in Fayetteville NC, interprets it as a straightforward compound of Fayer and Ejar, meaning sheep islands, about their abundance on the archipelago. Clergymen Peter Clauson and Lucas Deebs began casting doubt on this theory in the 16th and 17th centuries, arguing that the West Norse-speaking settlers, whose word for sheep was sor instead of the East Norse Fayer, could not have coined it from this exact origin. Deebs surmised that it could have derived from Fjör, while Hammershaimb leaned towards Faroe. Others have theorized an Old Irish origin, relating it to the etymologies of neighbouring Orkney and Shetland. Scottish writers James Curry and William J. Watson suggested the words fir, pasture, eaten up outfield, and firen as possible derivations, arguing that the original Celtic attestations of the islands made this more likely. Archaeologist Anton Wilhelm Broger concurred, elaborating on Watson's theory by positing that the Norse, having first learned of the islands from Scottish and Irish accounts as a firen, could have coined Fayerejar as a phono-semantic match. Archaeological studies from 2021 found evidence of settlement on the islands before the arrival of Norse settlers, uncovering burnt grains of domesticated barley and peat ash deposited in two phases. The first dated between the mid-4th and mid-6th centuries, and another between the late 6th and late 8th centuries. Researchers have also found sheep DNA in lakebed sediments dating to the year 500. Barley and sheep had to have been brought to the islands by humans, as Scandinavians did not begin using sails until about 750, it is unlikely they could have reached the Faroes before then, leading to the study concluding that the settlers were more likely to originate from Scotland or Ireland. These findings concur with historical accounts from the same period. Archaeologist Mike Church noted that Irish monk de Kuel described a group of islands north of Scotland of very similar character to the Faroe Islands in his work De Mentura Orbis Terrae, of the measure of the worlds of the earth. In this text, de Kuel describes a group of small islands, nearly all of them separated by narrow stretches of water, that was always deserted since the beginning of time, and previously populated by Herematai ex Nostra Scotia for almost 100 years before being displaced by the arrival of Norse pirates. Church argued that these were likely the Eremitic Papar that had similarly resided in parts of Iceland and Scotland in the same period. Writers like Broger and Peter Andreas Munch had drawn the same connections from de Kuel's writings, with the latter arguing that these Papar were also the ones to bring sheep to the islands. A 9th-century voyage tale concerning Irish Saint Brendan, one of de Kuel's contemporaries, details him visiting an unnamed northern group of islands. This has also been argued to be referring to the Faroe Islands, though not nearly as conclusively. Some toponyms around the islands refer to the Papar and the Irish, such as Paperoker near Vestmanna and Paperskilser near Sakesoon. Vestmanna is itself short for Vestmannahoven. Tombstones in a churchyard on Skavoy display a possible Gaelic origin or influence. Old Norse-speaking settlers arrived in the early 9th century, and their Old West Norse dialect would later evolve into the modern Faroese language. A number of the settlers were Norse Gaels who did not come directly from Scandinavia, but rather from Norse communities that spanned the Irish Sea, Northern Isles, and Outer Hebrides of Scotland, including the Shetland and Orkney Islands. These settlers also brought thralls of Gaelic origin with them, and this admixture is reflected today in the Faroese genetic makeup and many loanwords from Old Irish. A traditional name for the islands in Irish, Na Sigeri, possibly derives from Aegea Skejar, a nickname given to island dwellers. According to Fayetteville Saga, many of the Norwegian settlers in particular were spurred by their disapproval of the monarchy of Harald Fairhair, whose rule was also seen as an inciting factor for the settlement of Iceland. The founding date of the Lagting is not historically documented. However, the saga implies that it was a well-established institution by the middle of the 10th century, when a legal dispute between chieftains Havgrimur and Einar Suðuroyingur, resulting in the exile of Eldjarn Kamhatur, is recounted in detail. Christianity was introduced to the islands in the late 10th and early 11th centuries by chieftain Sigmundur Brestison, baptized as an adult by then King of Norway Olaf Tryggvason. His mission to introduce Christianity was part of a greater plan to seize the islands on behalf of the Norwegian crown, while Christianity arrived at the same time as in Iceland. The process was met with much more conflict and violence, and was defined particularly by Sigmundar's conflict with rival chieftain Trondur I Gotu, the latter of whom was converted under threat of decapitation. Although their conflict resulted in Sigmundar's murder, the islands fell firmly under Norwegian rule following Trondur's death in 1035. While the Faroe Islands formally remained a Norwegian possession until 1814, Norway's merger into the Kalmar Union in 1397 gradually resulted in the islands coming under de facto Danish control. When the Protestant Reformation reached the Faroe Islands in 1538, the Faroese language was also outlawed in schools, churches, and official documentation. Thus Faroese remained exclusively a spoken language until the 19th century. Following the Napoleonic Wars, the union between Denmark and Norway was dissolved by the Treaty of Kiel in 1814. While Norway was transferred to the Swedish crown, Denmark retained possession of Norway's North Atlantic territories, which included the Faroe Islands along with Greenland and Iceland. Shortly afterward, Denmark asserted control and began to restrict the island's autonomy. In 1816, the Faroe Islands was reconstituted as a county within the Danish kingdom. The Lagting, having operated continuously for almost a millennium, was dissolved and replaced by a Danish judiciary. And the post of Lagmor was likewise replaced by a Danish-appointed amtmand. As part of its mercantilist economic policy, Denmark maintained a monopoly over trade with the Faroe Islands and forbade the Faroese from trading with other countries. The trade monopoly in the Faroe Islands was eventually abolished in 1856, after which the area developed into a modern fishing-based economy with its own fishing fleet. In 1846, the Faroe Islands finally regained formal political representation when they were allocated 2 seats in the Danish Riksdag. The Lagting itself was reinstated as an advisory body to the Amtmand in 1852. Unofficial Faroese orthography was first introduced in 1846 by Lutheran minister Wenceslaus Ulricus Hammershaimb, returning the language to print after 300 years of only existing in oral form. With the return of written Faroese to the public sphere after more than 300 years, nationalism gained a foothold in Faroese society. The modern Faroese national movement is commonly agreed to have begun with the Christmas meeting of 1888, held to discuss how to defend the Faroese language and Faroese traditions. This meeting led to the rise of 2 of the movement's most prominent early figures, Jonas Patterson and Rasmus Efferso. It was initially exclusively concerned with the status of the Faroese language, but it soon gained a political dimension with the advent of the Faroese language conflict in the early 20th century. Both sides of the conflict were represented by the country's first ever political parties. The Union Party, founded in 1906, which supported Faroese literature but opposed its usage in education. And the Self-Government Party, which sought to introduce Faroese as the official language in all public spheres and additionally demanded increased political autonomy for the islands. The Faroese language gradually won out. Laws and protocols of the Lagting were written in Faroese from 1927 onwards. Schools switched to Faroese as the language of instruction in 1938. And Faroese was fully authorized as the language of the church the following year. Finally in 1944, Faroese gained equal status with Danish in legal proceedings. In the first year of the Second World War, on April 12, 1940, British troops occupied the Faroe Islands in Operation Valentine. Nazi Germany had invaded Denmark and commenced the invasion of Norway on April 9, 1940 under Operation Weserubung. In 1942–1943, the British Royal Engineers, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel William Law, built the first and only airport in the Faroe Islands, Vagar Airport. The British refrained from governing Faroese internal affairs, and the islands became effectively self-governing during the war. After the war ended and the British Army left, this period in Iceland's declaration as a republic in 1944 served as a precedent and a model in the mind of many Faroe Islanders. The Lagting held an independence referendum on September 14, 1946, resulting in a very narrow majority for independence, 50.73% voted in favor and 49.27% against. The margin was only 161 votes. The Lagting subsequently declared independence on September 18, 1946. This declaration was annulled by Denmark on September 20, arguing that the number of invalid votes being greater than the narrow margin in favor made the result invalid. As a result, King Christian X of Denmark ordered that the Faroese Lagting be dissolved on September 24. With new elections held that November. The Faroese parliamentary election of 1946 resulted in a majority for parties opposed to independence. Following protracted negotiations, Denmark granted home rule to the Faroe Islands on March 30, 1948. This agreement granted the islands a high degree of autonomy, and Faroese finally became the official language in all public spheres. In 1973 the Faroe Islands declined to join Denmark in entering the European Economic Community. As a result, the islands are not part of the European Union today. Following the collapse of the fishing industry in the early 1990s, the Faroes experienced considerable economic difficulties. The Faroe Islands are an island group consisting of 18 major islands about 655 kilometers off the coast of northern Europe. Between the Norwegian Sea and the North Atlantic Ocean, about halfway between Iceland and Norway, the closest neighbors being the Northern Isles and the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. Its coordinates are 62°00 and 06°47'. The islands cover an area of 1,399 square kilometers and have small lakes and rivers, but no major ones. There are 1,117 kilometers of coastline. The only significant uninhabited island is Lilla-Dimmun. The islands are rugged and rocky with some low peaks, the coasts are mostly cliffs. The highest point is Slayataratindur in northern East Uruguay, 882 meters above sea level. The Faroe Islands are made up of an approximately 6 kilometers thick succession of mostly basaltic lava that was part of the Great North Atlantic Igneous Province during the Paleogene period. The lavas erupted during the opening of the North Atlantic Ocean, which began about 60 million years ago. And what is today the Faroe Islands was then attached to Greenland. The lavas are underlain by circa 30 kilometers of unidentified ancient continental crust. The climate is classed as subpolar oceanic climate according to the Köppen climate classification. CFC, with areas having a tundra climate, especially in the mountains, although some coastal or low-lying areas may have very mild winter versions of a tundra climate. The overall character of the climate of the islands is influenced by the strong warming influence of the Atlantic Ocean, which produces the North Atlantic Current. This, together with the remoteness of any source of landmass-induced warm or cold airflows, ensures that winters are mild while summers are cool. The islands are windy, cloudy, and cool throughout the year with an average of 210 rainy or snowy days per year. The islands lie in the path of depressions moving northeast, making strong winds and heavy rain possible at all times of the year. Sunny days are rare and overcast days are common. Hurricane Faith struck the Faroe Islands on September 5, 1966 with sustained winds over 100 miles per hour, and only then did the storm cease to be a tropical system. The climate varies greatly over small distances, due to the altitude, ocean currents, topography, and winds. Precipitation varies considerably throughout the archipelago. In some highland areas, snow cover may last for months with snowfalls possible for the greater part of the year. While in some sheltered coastal locations, several years pass without any snowfall whatsoever. Tórshavn receives frosts more often than other areas just a short distance to the south. Snow also is seen at a much higher frequency than on outlying islands nearby. The area receives on average 49 frosts a year. The collection of meteorological data on the Faroe Islands began in 1867. Winter recording began in 1891, and the warmest winter occurred in 2016-17 with an average temperature of 6.1 degrees Celsius. The islands were built during a period of high volcanic activity in the early Paleogene around 50 to 60 million years ago. The islands are built up in layers of different lava flows alternating with thin layers of volcanic ash. The soft ash and the hard basalt thus lie layer upon layer in narrow and thick strips. The soft tuff or ash zones erode relatively quickly, and the hard lump of basalt above the eroded tuff falls away, forming the first terrace. Volcanic activity has varied over millions of years, with periods of quiescence and various periods of quiet eruptive fissures and explosive volcanism. In a few places, mainly on Faroe, thin layers of coal are present, which are the remains of swamp forests from the time between volcanic eruptions. The plateau has therefore been divided into different basalt series according to the course of volcanism and the age sequence of the layers. There are major differences in the shapes of the island's terraces. The lowest and oldest series are thick lava deposits that can be seen on the southern part of Faroe, Mykines, Tindolmer, and the western side of Vagar. The basalts of the lower basalt series are often pillared, which is shown by elongated, angular, and regular pillars in the mountainside. Very regular vertical columns are found on northern Mykines, where they can be up to 30 meters high. The middle basalt series consists of thin lava flows with a highly porous interlayer. This series has very little resistance to crumbling and weathering. As these erosion processes are more severe at higher altitudes than lower down, the lowlands are filled with weathering material from the heights, often resulting in a characteristic curved landscape shape. This can be seen in Vagar, the northernmost part of Streymoy, and the northwestern part of East Faroe. Glacial activity has reduced plateau surfaces, especially on the northern islands, where the surfaces have been reduced to a series of narrower or wider zigzag rows along the length of the islands. Especially on the islands of Kunoy, Kalsoy, and Borowy, where an eastward and a westward ice mass have eroded the intervening mountain range into a narrow ridge. The culture of the Faroe Islands has its roots in the Nordic culture. The Faroe Islands were long isolated from the main cultural phases and movements that swept across parts of Europe. This means that they have maintained a great part of their traditional culture. The language spoken is Faroese, which is one of three insular North Germanic languages descended from the Old Norse language spoken in Scandinavia in the Viking Age. The others being Icelandic and the extinct Norn, which is thought to have been mutually intelligible with Faroese. Until the 15th century, the Faroese had a similar orthography to Icelandic and Norwegian, but after the Reformation in 1538, the ruling Norwegians outlawed its use in schools, churches, and official documents. Although a rich spoken tradition survived, for 300 years the language was not written down. This means that all poems and stories were handed down orally. These works were split into the following divisions: Sagnir, Eventyr and Kvi, often set to music and the medieval chain dance. These were eventually written down in the 19th century.
And you guys, that is all I have right now for the Faroe Islands. I thought that this would be a good video. I hope you all are doing well. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share. I hope you all have a great day. Much love.